Welcome to Tea Time, my friends, a place where I muse about my gender transition experiences and in the process aim to comfort and inspire others to a greater level of self-awareness. I am Artemis. Today we are sipping on a hot cup of dark chocolate cocoa raspberry truffle tea, courtesy of the Rose and Vine Gift Company. It is hot today because it's been storming most of the evening, and, well, let's see, we are getting into August now, which apparently for most folks is time to start getting excited about fall. So we've made a hot cup of tea for that, to celebrate the occasion. So today we are going to be navigating the intensely debated and hot topic of labels
Loose Voititium. Veloué Sizzle. A people Kader Vine Jar.
as they relate to the oh-so-affectionately referred to the alphabet soup community, which, for those of you not in the know, that is a rather, in my opinion, appropriate comedic jab at the growing number of letters in the LGBTQIA plus squared to the 10th power multiplied by infinity community. So we love them, we hate them, labels. Our brain devotes a lot of time to creating labels for things to ultimately make our lives easier. So for example, let's just say you walk into a room and you have to learn every single time that the light switch is for illuminating the room, that the remote is for turning on the TV, and that large hunk of upholstery in the corner of the room is where you're supposed to park your butt, aka the couch. Now, if every time you entered a room you would have to re-identify these items and create a label for them, it would make your day arduous, taxing, and ultimately you'd hardly get anything done. So our brain, once we learn to label things, will not return to those labels, will not question them, in an effort to put your life on autopilot so that you can get more and more accomplished, which to some degree, this is a good thing. We do want to have certain definitions in place so that we don't have to keep revisiting them, and we can continue to build on our knowledge of things so that we can have, we can make progress and we can have meaningful discussions about things and place more experience and knowledge as we go. So once we learn to label certain things, we tend not to go back and revisit our definition of those labels in order to just simplify our life. But when you're talking about things that could be as complicated and emotionally evocative as sexuality or gender labels, if we don't remain conscious and curious of these things and continue to ask questions, this is where you can run into trouble. It seems on top of this, our culture has gone completely label happy and created what is abysmally now known as the alphabet soup community, in reference to the ever-growing letters in the LGBTQIA plus community. And honestly, I'm mortified to be lumped in with that community and that kind of labeling as a trans person, because when somebody learns that I'm trans, ultimately I end up spending more time consoling that person, who is usually petrified that they're going to say something wrong that might offend me, instead of actually being able to have a productive discussion with that person. So first I'm going to talk about how labels can get us into trouble, and then I'm going to suggest a reason for why we're experiencing this phenomena of labels gone wild. So as we discussed in the opening of this video, it's not a bad thing to have labels. We do need labels to be able to have discussions about things so that we all have the same foundational understanding. But if we're not careful, what can happen is that identifying with a certain label can isolate us, can create differences, and focus on those differences rather than similarities. And some people may also use those labels to make judgments and assumptions about a group as a whole, and they forget that there is nuance within a group. So sometimes people can fall into the trap of enmeshing themselves or being identifying too much with the group that they feel that they belong with, and this can actually, without any more conscious thought, can lead to feelings of being offended when somebody says something about that particular community. So as I said, this is a kind of groupthink. I did another video entitled How Not to Be Offended that talks a little bit more about the psychology behind this. But we have to be careful when we are labeling ourselves or groups of people that we don't fall victim to identifying too much with that particular group and failing to see the nuances within it, and then applying that to other people and creating divisions and differences between us and them. So it's important, though, to remember, as I said before, that labels aren't always a bad thing. For me, when I actually learned what it was to be transgender, or what a transgender person was, learning the definition of that word, of that label, actually helped me to understand myself better. And that's not always how everybody operates, but for me, that's how it worked, is that I actually had to come across the label or the definition before I could then identify my own emotions and relate that to myself, whether I fit that or I didn't. So like anything, we need to monitor ourselves and what we are thinking and feeling about things and how we are applying those labels to make sure that we're staying within healthy guidelines. Now, to discuss a little bit about the number of labels that we're seeing within the community, and I'm going to give a potential theory as to why we're seeing the number of these labels just skyrocket recently. So at the time of this video, I did a quick Google search just to see how many gender labels were out there currently. And I came across an article, which I'm going to link in the description below, that mentions 25 different gender labels. Now, this article said it wasn't exhaustive on the list, and the article did say that there are, quote, many, many more gender labels. And as you're going through reading some of these gender labels, I start to notice a pattern, and that is that there's a lot of repetition where there are words that they're coming up with different words that essentially mean the same thing, or when you cross-reference them, they actually directly contradict one another. So, for example, it says that aporagender, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, but aporagender is a gender identity describing people who have a strong sense of gender that isn't specifically male or female. And this umbrella term includes gender identities like androgyny and maverick. The definition of maverick, or I suppose the way that it's spelled is more French, which I don't know French, but we can say maverick. Essentially the same as aporagender, which, as it is defined, states a gender that is neither male nor female, but still a very present gender, whatever that means. Just something entirely different, quote unquote. So, again, not exactly sure what that means. But then this website even attempts to redefine what man and woman mean. So it goes on to define man and woman. And according to this article, states that woman is a person who identifies with the female gender, maybe either trans or cisgender, and a man is a person who identifies with the male gender, either trans or cis. Now, if you've watched my channels, you know that I like to go by dictionary definitions of things so that we can all agree on what something means and actually be able to have a discussion. If we can't do that, it's like speaking different languages. You cannot have meaningful dialogue with somebody because you don't even agree with the definitions of the words. We have to be careful here because in the era that we're living, people like to use their feelings as facts, and people's feelings can be widely diverse, which again, now we have nothing that we can agree on to actually have a discussion. So, that being said, gender is not the same as biological sex. It's something that is often confused and creates further confusion with anybody trying to have discussions with someone or even just understand things. So a man or a woman, by actual definition, is literally only referring to the biological sex of something. I personally am advocating for the use of masculine and feminine versus man or woman or male and female, because man, woman, male, female traditionally refers to the biological sex of something. If we use masculine and feminine in languages all over the world, that quite literally just denotes the essence or the personality or character traits of somebody that are more one or the other. It doesn't have to mean biological sex. That masculine and feminine, if anything, have more to do with gender and certainly not much at all to do with biological sex. So for me, you will often see me use masculine and feminine because it more denotes gender and completely removes the whole biological aspect from the equation. So it's really no wonder why you are seeing so much tension with people, because words are not being clearly defined and people are using their feelings as facts. So after reading this article, I realized that so many of these gender labels can be reduced to just a few gender labels or umbrella terms that we of course can have endless variety within, but it doesn't necessarily mean that we have to create a label for it. You, as a person, it's your job that whenever you're talking with somebody with whom you would like to have any kind of a relationship with, you may eventually define exactly how you see things, but it isn't necessary or even really very practical to have a label for something where there is just inherently so much potential variety.
And suddenly, you're down to 5.
So, why do I theorize that the number of gender labels is skyrocketing? I really don't think it's an easy question to answer, and some or a lot of it may just be my own personal theories. But one major thing that I am seeing is this overarching concept that a lot of these labels are referring to concepts that we've already put in place within our societal culture. As in, we are reinventing the wheel, because a lot of things that are social or psychological in nature are not actually being taught in any kind of structured way to kids or even adults for that matter. So, for example, the definition of demisexual is someone who, is someone only having sexual feelings for another that they have emotional connection to. So, we already have a word for this concept, and it's called mature romantic love, something that I think a lot of people never actually had an influence for or never were taught to understand, which would explain why our divorce rate and the ability for many people to have successful relationships is shockingly low. And not to mention, so demisexual, then, as it's defined, is the type of attachment in the overall psychological theory called attachment theory. So what the term demisexual is getting at is the emotional attraction to someone that then leads to sexual feelings, which is how mature sexual relationships are supposed to work. So let's say, for the sake of argument, that demisexual was actually a legitimate term used to describe an emotional attachment to somebody that leads to sexual attraction. I suppose if you wanted one word instead of 3 that described your needs for sexual attraction, you could make up a word, but demisexual would not be it. So let's break the word down. Demi, meaning half of or partially to an inferior degree, as dictionary.com defines. So like a demigod in Greek mythology was only half a god, inferior to an actual god. So maybe correct me if I'm wrong, but I really don't think people mean to indicate that when they're talking about their sexual preferences. Especially when, according to this article, words like demi-boy or demi-girl are said to mean somewhat boy or girl, but not entirely. But at least in those contexts, the term demi, or the prefix demi, is actually being used properly. So when you think about it, demisexual, then, if you were to define it as its prefix, and then its the prefix and the word following it means, it would mean something like somewhat sexual but not entirely, which, I mean, for me, kind of sounds like what happens right after a tee shot and I've worked a 12-hour day.
But I'm less tired.
But I digress. So, as I said before, a reason for the creation of so many of these labels seems to me like it's kind of a reinvention of the wheel, where people are coming up with these terms, not realizing that we already have terms to describe a lot of what they're talking about, but even in the midst of all of that, they still are ignoring the actual definitions of the words or definitions of the prefixes when they're creating further definitions, which just leads to more chaos and more confusion. So, I mean, don't get me wrong, I'm all for the spirit of discovery and invention, but again, we have to come to agree on the same base set of definitions so that we can have a solid foundation and a springboard to be able to create things that won't create more confusion instead. So lastly, I will say that the whole, snowflake concept that people are wanting to be unique might also be leading to this creation of all these different labels. And again, diversity and ingenuity are fantastic, but when they lead to more confusion than they do clear understanding, it's time to herd the cats and pluck the weeds, my friends. And I'm sure I'm going to catch a lot of crap for the thoughts that I've put out in this video. But the goal of this channel is to do just that. Herd the cats and pluck the weeds. In other words, I aim to bring clarity and sanity, and sometimes you have to piss off some wayward cats and get dirt underneath your fingernails to do just that. So until next time, stay thirsty, my friends.